Mikayla.
Welcome, everybody, back to the Lectionary Lounge. Byrnese, how did last week go for you?
It went okay. How about you, Mikayla?
It went well. I ended up preaching on the Hebrews text as we discussed, and I took it in a way where really focusing on the story of Jesus, because in a look at what is the entirety of the book of Hebrews about, there really seems to be this overall theme of the author being like, yes, Jesus is worth it. And so that made me think of the Rachel Held Evans quote where she says, I'm still a Christian because the story of Jesus is still the one I'm willing to risk being wrong about, which has been a huge, important quote for me for the last many years. And so I I started off my message talking about Rachel and about how important her writings have been, and her conviction that the story of Jesus is still one that is we should be willing to risk being wrong about, and why that is, and all of that, and then tied that into the Hebrews passage and the great high priest, and who is not unable to sympathize with us and our weaknesses. So talked about that. I think it went well. It ended up being a weirdly short service. I all of a sudden looked down at the clock and it was only like 45 minutes in, and we were about to sing our closing hymn. So I'm sure my folks appreciated that, but it was a surprise.
Oh, that's funny. We did the Mark text this week, which I think I probably said last week was kind of my plan.
Okay.
We did, yeah, I did end up exploring for a moment the fact that when Jesus talks about the wealthy folks,
Yeah.
that we're living in America,
Mm,
and statistically, he's talking about us.
mhm.
Like compared to people around the world,
Mhm.
like compared to, I went through some Pew Research data and talked about how 55% of Americans are in the highest income category globally.
Mhm.
People who make $50 or more per day and all of
Mhm.
these things. So I did touch on that.
Mhm.
And then I also spent time talking about how for Peter, what the experience of this was like, because of kind of his reaction in the kind of end of that story, and went through Peter's, experiences with Jesus a little bit. Talked about
Mhm.
how Peter had been there for the feeding of the 5,000, that
Mhm.
the things that Peter had seen, and also, he had had some pretty rough days.
Mhm.
So Peter had, been called Satan at one point.
Yikes.
He knew that John the Baptist had been killed.
Yeah.
And so, like, for Peter, what the experience of hearing that all of the work that I have put in doesn't come with a guarantee that I'm getting, into the kingdom of
Yeah.
heaven,
Yeah.
for lack of a better way to put it. Kind of talked about that. What is it like? Where is Jesus when it feels like the rug has been pulled out from under us?
Mhm.
Like for Peter, he had these expectations and this plan that this was all going to go a certain way, and then in this one little teaching from Jesus, the rug gets pulled out.
Yeah.
And so, what does that mean when that happens for us? Um, is Jesus still worth it if our things don't work out the way that we planned them or expected
Mm.
them to?
Mhm.
And so on and so forth. And so, yeah,
Mhm.
honestly, we did end up talking about, like, is Jesus worth it?
Mhm.
Which is funny because we came there through Mark and you
Yeah.
came there through Hebrews.
I think it's the question that's plaguing so many of us always, right? Especially in this day and age when there are those who are our siblings in the Christian faith who are not necessarily making Jesus seem worth it. And so there is this I think there is this underlying question for all of us is all of this worth it? Especially maybe if we're in shrinking congregations, if we're in congregations that we're not necessarily seeing a lot of life all the time. There maybe is this feeling of, is Jesus worth it? Is this worth it? And so getting to explore that through whatever scriptures there are, because I think that is often the theme of the New Testament of, yeah, Jesus is worth it.
Well, and I think the it is also a really big question. Like,
Mhm.
what's the purpose behind the question that we're asking?
Mhm.
Is Jesus worth us having this building, doing this
Right.
ministry, blah, 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 is a very different question than, is
Mhm.
Jesus worth my life and faith and like
Mhm.
allegiance?
Totally.
Uh, but I think that most of the time, most of our members of our
Mhm.
congregation are, at least in my setting, kind of having to take on the burden of that first question.
Yeah.
Is Jesus worth the rent?
Yeah.
Is Jesus worth the upkeep? Is Jesus worth these things? And those are, two very different questions.
Very different questions, and not necessarily connected always
Right.
either. So,
And lots of churches are called to have a building and do ministry in a space and all of
Yep.
these things. And a lot of churches aren't.
Right.
And that's okay too.
It is more than okay.
Yep.
More than okay.
It's actually the better thing to do the thing that you're actually being called to do
Right.
instead of the thing you think you're supposed to do because all the other churches are doing it. But I digress.
Anyway, that's probably a conversation for another podcast. Or maybe it's the conversation for this upcoming week. I don't know. What are you going to preach on this week, Byrnese?
Oh, that's a great question. Okay, so we have a couple of different interesting texts here in the different pericopes for the lectionary this week. So we do have Job, Job chapter 38. So this is like Job is getting his bad attitude handed back to him, where God's like, "Excuse me, can I bug you for a sec? But were you freaking there when I made this? I don't think you were, son." So we got that. That's one option. I think it's fantastic. But we haven't been in Job like I had thought we were going to be. So then do we jump in there? I'm not sure. We've got a psalm. We got Psalm 104, which I think works really well paired with the Job passage. We have Isaiah 53. So that's the text on the suffering servant, which frankly I think is really interesting to engage with outside of the Advent or Lent cycle or Easter cycle. So that's kind of an interesting one to potentially get to explore. We have another psalm. We have Psalm 91. So pick your psalm here.
Yeah.
We still have Hebrews. So we're continuing to work through that. We're going to explore more of the Melchizedek stuff. And we've got the gospel reading. So it's like, we always have all of these options, but I don't always feel like all of them are what I could actually preach on.
Yes.
They're never bad. I don't think the scripture is bad, but sometimes it's just not.
Some of them feel like a stronger launching point for a sermon.
Yes.
Off the bat than others.
Yes. And you know what? I'm going to be honest. I'd love if we read them all. If we did the thing where we actually read all these things out loud. We don't do that. And my congregation has no interest in doing that. And that's totally fine. But I think I'm going to preach out of Mark.
All right.
Yeah. What about you? Do you know what passage you're going to jump into this week?
I was debating possibly preaching Job, but it's been a minute since I preached the gospel because I did all of James when we had the James split over 5 weeks a month and a half ago. I think that started. And then I did a Psalm and then I did Hebrews. And so it's just been a while since we read and engaged with the gospel, so I'm gonna take on the Mark text.
Well, and honestly, that was my experience too. I don't feel like I had actually preached the gospel text in quite a while until this week, until like last week.
Okay.
So I'm kind of actually surprising myself by how much I'm enjoying it. I love Jesus. I love the Jesus stories. I don't always love Mark's take on the Jesus stories. It's not my favorite gospel, and it's still good.
Yeah.
So, I have been surprising myself by how much I've been enjoying being in Mark.
It's Mark 10, I think, verses 35 through 45. And it's the passage where two of the disciples, I believe the sons of Zebedee,
yes,
are asking. They have a question for Jesus, and it's one that they don't quite know what they're asking.
Well, and honestly, it's so funny to me. I'm always surprised by which passages the lectionary skips.
Yeah.
So the past couple of weeks we've been pretty continuous. Like we had 2 weeks ago, we had Mark 10, 1 through 16. Today we had 17 through 31, and now we're skipping to 35. The passage that we're skipping between 31 and 35 is Jesus predicting his death and resurrection. And so Jesus is walking with the disciples. Like it doesn't read like it's super separate from the other story that's happening. And they're going for a walk, hiking on up to Jerusalem, and they're all talking, and he's saying, you know, I'm going to be handed over. Like, we're going to Jerusalem. I'm turning myself in.
Mm.
This is the way that this is going to go. And immediately, then James and John say, okay, well, we want a part of that or something, maybe. We don't really know what we're asking for, but we want to be cool like you.
Yeah.
It's not a separate story, but we
No.
still miss that part of the text. And I always think that's really interesting when those kind of,
Mhm.
I mean, I'm sure it's in the lectionary somewhere else. Like, it was
Yeah.
probably, maybe it was in our Holy Week readings or something like that. But
Yeah. Well, there's a few different places that he predicts his death. And so I wonder if we have had it before, we're coming up to it again. And so sometimes I think the lectionary decides to skip those when it feels like it's already
circular.
had that conversation beforehand. But it could be an interesting way to expand the pericope if we wanted to bring it in, because it is kind of a curious thing of why were these disciples just randomly, seemingly to ask Jesus to be at his right hand. You know, it kind of, if you don't have it before, like, that feels very out of the blue.
Yeah, I love the way that the James and John, I love the way they ask this question. So
Read it.
I have 3 kids. This is something my kids would pull. This is this is James and John, the sons of Zebedee. They come to Jesus and they said, this is scripture. I'm reading this from the Bible. Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask. What do you want me to do for you? Jesus asked. They said, allow one of us to sit on your right and the other on your left when you enter your glory. Jesus responds, you don't know what you're asking. Can you drink the cup I drink or receive the baptism I receive? My kids, 100%, would walk up to me and they're like, Mom, we want you to do what we tell you to do. We're going to ask you a question here in a minute and we want you to say yes. That would be how they would lead.
I can hear your children
Yes.
saying that.
They
I
would
can
be
hear
like,
it.
they would decide that they want to go for a walk or they want to
Yeah.
they want to have ice cream with dinner or something.
Yes.
And they'd be like, Mama, we're going to, you need to give me what I want. Is basically how it would go.
Yes, and they would hang off of you, all the things.
Yep,
Yes.
big puppy eyes.
Uh-huh.
That's all I see here with James and John. And I love picturing the disciples as teenagers because then you kind of see, look, they're just big puppy kids.
They are.
They're just earnest and sweet and stupid.
Yes.
If you have teenage boys, I'm sorry. I don't think they're all stupid, but I think they do all have their moments.
Their prefrontal
when
cortexes
I was
are
a teenager, I was stupid.
They're just your prefrontal cortex is not fully developed. And so you're going to say things we all did when we were teenagers that are just lacking some brightness.
Yeah.
And so, you know,
there were days. I mean, one of the things that we talk about now, like in 2024 internet discourse, have you ever heard, like, if I say orange cat energy?
Yeah.
There were days in high school where I did not have 2 brain cells to rub together, but I had orange cat energy. I brought the vibe.
Amazing.
And so I would have done stupid things and said stupid things.
I did stupid
teenage me
things.
did those things.
Especially, I feel like growing up as an evangelical teenager who was crazy zealous for my faith and for God, and just really that was all. It was all I did. Did
you ever think through what your last words would be when you were martyred?
Yeah. Like, I thought it was like the last words whenever I died. Like, that was just like, what are the last things I'm going to think about on my deathbed, wherever that could be. I think I remember like going to sleep as a teenager and making sure I'd confessed like all of my sins in case I died while I was asleep.
I would like rehearse this in my brain. I would be like, okay, so if we have a school shooting today, and they like come for me, I'm going to stand up for Jesus. You know, like, what was her name? Rachel?
Yes.
This like Columbine girl who we were told the story of that we all needed to be like her. And so I rehearsed my martyrdom in my brain. Or like when I got left behind for some reason. Even though I like loved Jesus.
Right.
And I definitely shouldn't get left behind.
You know.
But I was gonna get left behind. Yes. And what was I gonna do? And I had to like walk through and like rehearse my left behind plan all the time.
Yes, totally. No, all of those things. So like exactly this, right?
Right.
Stupid things that we said or did when we were teenagers trying to follow Jesus.
Yes.
So like putting ourselves right there with with James and
Yep.
John in
Yep.
this text today.
They have big hearts.
Yeah.
Their brains will catch up.
Exactly. And I think Jesus knows that. And so I think that's why his response is what it is, right? He's like, you guys just don't know what you're asking.
Right.
I mean, you can read that in so many ways. I think I have heard it most often preached in kind of like an angry way, which is very surprising actually when I read the text of like you don't know what you're asking. How dare you ask
Mm-hmm.
that kind of a
Mm-hmm.
question? And that could be in there. I don't know. Or it could just be like, you guys don't know what you're
Mm-hmm.
asking. Um, and so that is an interesting way too to think about how do we interpret the tone that maybe Jesus was using with the disciples is certainly something that's probably up for interpretation a bit.
Absolutely. And I think it's so interesting to, I think the way that we perceive masculinity and fatherhood and like all of those things
Mm-hmm.
also really plays in how we interpret Jesus in these settings and situations, because this is really a sweet, almost paternal moment that he's having with the two
Mm-hmm.
disciples here. And he kind of gives them, so like in the Hebrew Bible,
Mm-hmm.
we see this tradition of the gift of a blessing
Mm-hmm.
given to the son. So like there's like an extended like example of this when Israel blesses his 12 sons and
Mm-hmm.
each of them gets like, and
Yes.
they're like a mixed bag. So
Yeah.
like they're not,
Not all great.
they are a prophecy.
Uh-huh.
They are not like rosy,
Yes.
happy,
No.
you're going to be happy forever and
No, they are
rich
not.
sort of blessings. And so we kind of actually almost see that here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So Jesus turns to these two disciples and he says, "The cup that I drink, you will drink. And with the baptism which I am baptized, you will be baptized." And that
Mm-hmm.
really falls into that tradition
Mm-hmm.
of this, fatherhood blessing at the end of their life, at the end of
Mm-hmm.
the father's life, given to
Yeah.
the one who's going to receive it. And so, yeah, like we
That's an
see
interesting thought. Yeah.
what we think of as a father plays into this text.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think where I will probably spend the majority of my time in my sermon is the end of this pericope, where it's talking about being a servant. And
Listen, this is not the point, but I do have to say that I think the word pericope is really cute. I have always thought that. It's such a cute
it
word.
is a fun word. It's a fun word to say. I appreciate it. But yes, no, I think I really want to sit in kind of those last few verses where Jesus is saying, whoever wants to be first among you will be a servant of all to
Mhm.
all.
Mhm.
Um, for the Son of Man or the human one didn't come to be served, but rather to serve and to give his life to liberate many people.
Yes.
And
That'll preach.
man, in our present cultural moment in the United States, there is just such a rampant desire to be first and to be served by everything else.
Mhm.
And I think it's such a timely message for all of us in the cultural zeitgeist to say this is what it means. If we want to be first, whatever that means or looks like, if we're gonna, have that conversation with Jesus like James and John did, then we need to take on the posture of servanthood. We need to serve one another. We need to serve our communities. We need to take on the posture of Christ, who really did come to this world, not so that we would serve Christ, but that he could serve us. And I don't know. I think that's where I want to sit in that kind of idea of our identity as maybe Americans, as white Americans. My congregation is a pretty much all predominantly white, middle class ish congregation. Um, our church is situated in a mixed income neighborhood, but a predominantly middle class neighborhood, and so yeah, I don't know. I think it might be a good way to wrestle with our identity as Americans and our identity of Christians, and maybe have a conversation about maybe where we sometimes get the two mixed up.
Absolutely. I think it's also like a really good challenge to remember that like the thing that we want is not the gospel.
Mm,
Like we can get those things mixed up.
mm-hmm,
We can insist on our way, our plan, our thing, our insert object here.
mm-hmm,
Um and we can kind of get in the way. We can refuse to be a servant because we are
mm-hmm,
so preoccupied with that thing that we
mm-hmm.
are worshiping. Um but we have to remember that like sometimes the thing that we think is the most important that isn't Jesus, that isn't what
Mm-hmm.
actually we're being called to, is the thing that we have to sacrifice to
Yeah.
be able to follow Jesus well. You
Mm-hmm.
know, like it's like the story of the rich young ruler that we had
Mm-hmm.
this week, where he could not,
Yeah.
he would not.
He
It's
would
not that he
not.
could not. He would
Yes.
not give up the wealth and the possessions that he had to follow Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
I think often we aren't able to do that either.
Mm-hmm.
We aren't willing to do that either.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Partially for this reason here. It's not
Mm-hmm.
just about following Jesus, it's about giving up our position and
Mm-hmm.
becoming a servant
Mm-hmm.
instead of just taking and being
Yeah.
served and being fed and all of these things. We're not willing to do the work.
And not a false sense of humility either,
Mhm.
because I think, unfortunately, Moravians listening to this
Ooh, it's about to
podcast,
get spicy.
I love all of us dearly. Sometimes we have a real stronghold on this false sense of humility.
Mhm.
And that is not at all what Jesus is saying
Well, can
here.
you say more about that? Because, like, what does that mean to have a false sense of humility?
I think it just means this desire of putting yourself in a place and doing certain tasks to appear humble. But in reality, you're doing it to receive praise, to receive some kind of adoration from folks. You're not doing it for the purpose of actually serving and caring for folks, but you're doing it for something more.
Yeah.
And or you're doing it to appear holy, or you're doing it to appear pious, uh, instead of just doing it to do it.
Well, yeah. I
And
think we also kind of misconstrue what humility is, because I
yes,
think humility is not lying about what you're good at.
no,
Humility is not um,
yeah, that, yes,
hiding
yeah,
your gifts or your
mm-hmm,
skills. Like, I don't think sometimes it can seem like, let's just say for me, I'm pretty comfortable doing public speaking,
mm-hmm,
which I mean makes sense because I'm a pastor and I
yes,
do the pulpit thing, but I didn't used to be a
right,
pastor doing the pulpit thing.
yeah,
And so people would kind of get a little flustered because I'm happy to and quite good at leading a public conversation.
mm-hmm,
And so I would get a lot of, you're not humble. You're always
yeah,
trying to take the lead in these conversations, blah,
yeah,
blah, blah. No, I'm actually just quite good at this.
yes,
You know, I'm quite good
right,
at facilitating a public conversation. I'm not distressed by doing this in front of people. So
mm-hmm,
it makes sense for me to do this. It's
mm-hmm,
part of my gifting.
mm-hmm,
Saying that isn't me not being humble. In
mm-hmm,
fact, it would be inappropriate for me to make light of or mock the
right,
gifts that God has given me
totally,
for the service of his church.
mm-hmm,
Um, but sometimes when we see people who are gifted in the church, who are honest about what they are good at,
mm-hmm,
who are open about their gifting and want to pursue using their gifts for the service of the church,
mm-hmm,
we say, "Oh, that person's not very humble," because they're honest about what they're good at, and it makes us uncomfortable.
yeah. Yeah, because we're not ready to be honest, maybe with what we are good at or what we're not good at. I think that that can also sometimes be an important conversation of sometimes we should be using our energies and gifts somewhere else. And, but yeah, we're not willing to have that conversation about ourselves. And so when we see other people maybe living freely in their identity in Christ, and what does that all bring out in them, it can be an uncomfortable conversation. And so, yeah, I think just, and I don't think this is a solely Moravian issue. I think that this can be an issue for a lot of folks in a lot of different church traditions.
I mean, we both lived in the Midwest, so
Yeah. Listen, you can take the girl out of Minnesota. You cannot totally take all the Minnesota out of the kernel. And so,
Well, and I think this is also particularly important for us to talk about as women
yeah.
because we are socialized to practice this false humility and to
Mhm.
make very little of ourselves.
Mhm.
And that's a big part of why women do not succeed in the workplace in the same way that men do, because
Mhm.
men are actually encouraged to talk about their skills and their development and all of these things. And women are told that's not becoming for a
Right.
woman.
Don't, yeah.
Don't do that. That's not appropriate.
Right.
It's not. It's perfectly good to
Yes.
talk about those things, but we are socialized not to, especially within the church.
Especially within the church. And yeah, I think I love how you mentioned how by not being honest about the gifts that you have, it really kind of is a slap in the face of what God has done for you in your life, right? Of leading you to a place where maybe you are incredibly comfortable with public speaking. That is not something that everybody is gifted with. And so that is such a it, to be able to tie that into something that God has done in your life, that is a way to still be humble about some kind of gifting that you have in your life, whatever it might be, but to still honor it and use it for the family of God, for all of us to grow together, to learn together. And yeah, so I think it's just wanting to make sure that we're not making Jesus sound like he's just saying just act humble, but no, he's like saying, hey, take a posture of servanthood, serve one another. That is how you get closer to me.
Right, because if Jesus can literally call himself the Son of Man, the human one, like God's divine chosen person, and fully embody humility
Yep.
through washing feet, through healings and service and
Mhm.
ministry. If Jesus can be doing both of those things, Jesus does not mess around. Like he's like, no, 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 no. I'm like called to do this work.
Mhm.
I am appointed to this work. I do these healings and I don't pretend that I'm not doing them. Jesus is fully living into his gifts and his call and is the embodiment of servant, like love, care that we are all supposed to be like trying to emulate.
Yep.
If he
Yep.
can do it, we don't need to say that people have to be quiet about their gifts just to be a good Christian.
And how much more beautiful could our communities be, right? If we all bring things to the table that we have to offer. There are people that are really good at public speaking. So, how do we help train them to be excellent preachers and students of the scriptures? There are folks in our communities that are excellent in the kitchen and can bake phenomenal communion bread or help prepare meals for the community. We've got folks that are great with caring for each other, and so they're going to be on the phone checking in with folks, writing cards. They're going to be talking to you before the service and after service. They don't see you in a few weeks. They're going to make sure that you do not go unnoticed. We've got folks who are really good at just having connections everywhere. I have a person in my congregation. I could give him the strangest request for the most obscure thing, and he would make sure he would somehow find it in a very timely fashion. And it always astounds me, and sometimes I do just want to like almost play it and see how what is the strangest thing I could ask him for, just to see if he could probably find it. But then I know he would, and so then I would need to come up with a reason for it. But just how can we all, if we all bring our gifts to the table, right? It's like a great dinner party. If we all brought whatever we were best at making, that would be a really amazing meal.
Listen, I would be here for that.
Exactly.
Well, and like we look at, there's a lot of imagery in the New Testament about the church as a body. And so, there are like my hand has a very different like set of strengths and weaknesses than like my shoulder. And expecting my hand to do shoulder stuff and vice versa, they are just not capable of doing those things. But if I fully empower, if I work out my shoulders and like strengthen them and use them and depend on them, they can do pretty cool stuff. They can like balance, I don't know what shoulders do, lift things, balance things, hold things up, but good shoulder stuff. And then the same with my hands. I'm not musical, so like I don't, but like if you were musical, your hands play music or your hands bake bread, or my hands do a lot of sewing.
I was just gonna say, your hands sew amazing creations all the time. They make amazing creations in the kitchen. Like it's yes.
but it's by fully empowering the thing to be itself
Mhm.
that you're able to do any of those things.
Totally.
It's not by forcing my hand to do shoulder stuff that I can
Mhm.
get any of my hand stuff done.
Well, I think that's a really interesting conversation to have about being a servant, because I wonder if we say be a servant, I would be super curious what folks in our congregations would say that means. What do we think what do they think they're being asked to do when we say take on this identity as a servant? Do they think that just means like sign up to be an usher? Do they think that just means sign up to do a lap in the nursery? Do they what I would be so curious, and maybe I'll even like flesh this out with some of my folks in a midweek Bible study this week. But if I ask you to take on the posture of a servant, what does that look like practically? Because it would be very, very interesting to somehow tie this in and frame it in how do we be servants from our giftings?
Mm-hmm.
What
Mm-hmm.
can we imagine and dream up of in our community if we all showed up to serve, but we did so within our strengths?
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. And honestly, that's the basis of community asset mapping.
Mhm.
Looking at what are the resources, strengths, abilities
Mhm.
that we have as a community.
Mhm.
If we just look at those, what can we do with those?
Exactly. Yeah, and then pulling it back into kind of the top of the scripture where they're asking pretty much we want to be close to you. We
Yeah.
want to be right there.
Mm-hmm.
And really saying when we take on this posture of servanthood, and if we do it from our strengths and what we feel we are being called to do, what we're being equipped to do, that is actually when we pursue that, we do get closer to
Well,
God.
no, that's it. That's exactly it. So,
Mhm.
you know what? There's like a really famous quote. There was some Olympian guy. He was a really fast runner.
I'm
You
sure
know
I
the
know.
guy that
I
we're
know the
talking
story. I
about.
can't remember the name.
So like he was Jesse Owens,
Maybe.
something like that. If you're listening to this podcast and you know who the heck I'm talking
Write it down.
about, yeah, text us.
Yeah.
But he was like an Olympic sprinter or
Mhm.
marathoner. He ran fast places, things I
Couldn't
don't
be
do.
me.
Couldn't be me. But like he talked about, he was a Christian. He was really formed by his faith, and he talked about, I feel the like joy and presence of God when I run.
Mhm.
And that's super true for me. Like, and I wrote about this in my credo last week. I feel the joy and presence of God. I talk about it like I feel like I'm stepping into the stream of God's love. Not every time I preach or whatever, but like sometimes when I am engaged in ministry and I am exactly where I'm supposed to be, doing exactly what I'm called and gifted for in that moment,
Mhm.
I feel like I'm stepping into the stream of God's love and
Mhm.
joy and pleasure. And
Yeah.
I'm sharing in that love that God always has for the world.
Mhm.
And that is what happens
Mhm.
when we are using our gifts in service of God, the church,
Mhm.
our neighbor,
Mhm.
whoever, and whatever that looks like for you. I don't think that experience is limited to people who recognize God or spirituality or like a divine presence. But whenever we step into what we were created to do, there's a light and a joy that comes into our being that I think all people can experience.
Mhm.
And I want all people to pursue, because when you do that, you are making your life better. Yes. You are making the whole world
Yep.
better by doing that thing.
Mhm.
Absolutely. No, without a
Mhm.
shadow of a doubt.
Yep. No. So I think that that's good food for thought as I think about the sermon. I'm excited. I'm excited. So, with that though in mind, what's going to keep you from writing the sermon in a timely fashion?
Well, we went apple picking today,
We did.
and I have a lot of apples.
You went crazy.
Well, there's 5 of
But
us. We've got
that's
3
true.
kids, 2 adults. If everyone picks 2 apples, that's a lot of
That
apples.
is. Yeah, your bucket was very full.
Yeah, and very heavy. So now we have a lot of apples that I need to figure out what the heck I'm going to do with them all. So that'll probably be
Yeah.
applesauce and apple crisp and apple pie and
Yum.
who knows whatever else this week. And all of the dishes associated with all of the apples that I will be baking. So that will keep me and my husband busy.
Amazing. Amazing.
What about
I will
you?
be showing up in your doorstep. I'm
Perfect.
sure.
You'll still smell it from Allentown.
Exactly. I'll just drive myself over.
Just assume that there's something baking and just show up.
Perfect. Will do. Will do. I think for me, what's gonna keep me from writing this sermon in a timely fashion that I would hope for, uh, if I'm looking at ministry things, I am starting something new, not this week, but next week. So this week is going to be finalizing some prep for it. But I'm starting this virtual Bible study fellowship hour, just out of some conversations that I've had with folks in my congregation, but also with folks not in my church that are just really longing for community where they can be honest about where they're at with their faith. And so it's called Scrappy Faith, and this idea of we're piecing our faith together with what we have, but also scrappy in the sense that, like, I have fought to get to my faith where it is. And so doing some last minute prep this week on getting that ready. It's open to everybody, Wednesdays at 7 p.m. Links will be online. But so just kind of finalizing that I think will probably take a lot of my energy this week. But outside of that,
Tell us about the puppy.
hopefully, I really hope I'm not jinxing myself by talking about this. I'm very much hoping that maybe when we record this next week, there will be little whimpers or something in the background.
Are you going to bring her over here?
I don't know. We'll see.
Well, I think we might have to push off recording next week if you have a brand new baby puppy.
I would not bring her the same day that I pick her up.
That would be intense.
But if we recorded maybe over Zoom, you maybe would hear her. But yeah, I want to give her a few days. I might be adopting a sweet little puppy. We will see. I'm talking to the rescue and trying to figure out all the details. So certainly, if that happens, and even before that, I probably would not get to bring her home until after this sermon will have needed to be written and preached. But even just knowing that this could be an addition to my life very, very soon will highly distract me.
You better put her on the Instagram.
From writing. Oh, listen.
We need a full announcement. We need like birth, like a birth announcement card that people send out in the mail.
I have plans.
Good.
Because she will be Calvary's new pastor. And yes, so yeah, yes.
I'm gonna have to sew her a little puppy stole.
Please. Or like a clergy collar
for
my
a goodness.
dog. Yes, no, there are plans are in the works. Future plans of co-hosted woofship services outside. Listen, I have.
You're gonna fully embrace this puppy pastor whole vibe. I'm excited.
Listen, I'm just here for the other sinkwads or dinkwads, single income, no kids with dogs, or double income.
I was gonna say this sounds like an insult. What are you saying?
Sorry, no, it is internet lingo. Internet lingo.
I have never been dual income, no kids, so I have never had that experience.
Yes. No, there's dinks and sinks, which were the first versions of those. So double income, no kids.
But now they have with
dogs. With the dog is where the wad comes in. So
that's funny.
We will see. Hopefully I'll have great news next week. If not, I'll be very, very sad in the recording. But yeah, that I think that's where we shall land today.
Well, wonderful.
We'll see if I can at least get an outline out of this while I have all of this still rumbling around in my head.
I believe in you. I believe in you significantly more than I believe in me.
Listen,
so
if we just believe in each other as much as we should believe in ourselves, I think we'll get there.
Perfect.
Cool. All right. Thanks everybody for listening, and we will be back with you next week.
Bye, friends.
Bye.